There's the part that you normally get from people who've been around a while, which is it's not all about the technology. It's not all about the code. A lot of the joy and the challenges are the people things. So that one is a given. But at the same time, don't deny yourself the technical thing. It's fun. It's enjoyable. Having that appreciation for detail is its own at one level is its own reward. So don't miss out on that.
In today's episode, I'm catching up with Kevlin Henney. Kevlin is an independent consultant, speaker, writer, and trainer. His software development interests are in programming, practice, and people. Kevlin is co-author of A Pattern Language for Distributed Computing and On Patterns and Pattern Languages. He is also editor of 97 Things Every Programmer Should Know and co-editor of 97 Things Every Java Programmer Should Know. Kevlin's first appearance as a guest was way back in episode 15, so I was delighted to catch up with him again and to learn about what he's been up to since we last spoke. So Kevlin, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me back.
No, I'm delighted to talk to you again. As I said just before we started recording, I very much remember the episode that we did. It was very early days for me doing the podcast, and I was very grateful that you took part, and to have you back, very much appreciated.
Yeah, I think in the pre-recording chat, I was surprised at how far back it was. So 7 years.
Yes.
7 years. So
Indeed,
it's been a while.
Indeed. We won't go too much on that. So a lot has happened. Well, that's probably a good place to start, actually. So maybe you could give us a bit of an insight into what you've been doing since, 2017?
Yeah. So I work for myself, and I do consultancy training, a lot of keynote speaking. And since 2017, well, obviously there's been a kind of a fairly tectonic shift in a number of things about how people have worked, and that certainly affected me. I find now that I am doing a lot more remotely. Certainly, I've shifted to perhaps I'm doing a little less consultancy. In fact, no, I'm doing quite a lot less consultancy. Most of what I do now has shifted much more into workshop and training space, doing things remotely. But occasionally doing one-to-ones and groups. And then I've shifted some of my conference load as well. Not so much online, but I've changed the way I do things and the way I travel as well. So in many ways, many of the same themes of what I was doing, but I guess delivered differently and structured differently.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was actually wondering about that because obviously you're very much focusing on doing keynote speeches.
Yeah.
And has that dramatically changed given what happened with the pandemic and obviously the sort of reduction potentially on things like conferences?
Yeah, the conference scene is quite interesting because it has changed the conference scene. Not all conferences have been able to get back up on their feet or back to where they want to be. But it's also invited a lot more experimentation. And I think it's also allowed some new conferences to fill the space to get in because there is an appetite for face-to-face contact. One of the things I have noticed is a kind of an uptick in, for example, meetup groups. I think particularly now with people taking the option to work remotely more, they still want human contact, but it's a case of like, why socialize and learn things? And I also see that with a number of companies who have switched to hybrid working, but then say, well, we want a 1 day or a 2 day event. Let's get somebody from the outside in to keynote or to lead a workshop. That there's an appetite for that because it's also an excuse for a company to get its people together in a way that perhaps it didn't even do before the pandemic. But by defining an event, it makes it a little more memorable. And so I found there's been a shift towards that. So I certainly could be saying yes to a lot more conferences than I'm going to at the moment, and I'm probably going to change that in the next year or two and increase. But it seems to have restored itself pretty much to, I won't say where it was. Not everybody's at the same level, but I have noticed new conferences as well. So from my point of view, that's kind of welcome. It's where I find I network a lot, where I meet people, and where I learn a lot of new ideas. That's been quite nice. But I have noticed a shift in kind of what people want from such events.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think you're right about the sort of the hybrid working approach now. Um, I did see actually somebody post, I won't name the person, but put on LinkedIn the other day that they would never now hire somebody who wanted to be completely remote. So you can imagine the bit of a backlash that
I
received.
can imagine, yeah.
Um, yeah, but it's interesting to see people's, you know, experience of having remote teams and how what it works in some circumstances and how it doesn't in others.
Yeah, I think it is an interesting one because I start hybrid working. I started doing hybrid working in 1996, so that's quite a while ago. So I in once, and that was while I was working for somebody before I went independent, and that's how they structure their work, training and consultancy, and and there was the understanding there was a great deal of trust, and that obviously we didn't have anywhere near the tools that we have now, but at the same time we didn't have the
Yeah.
same expectation that we have now of various things. So it always felt good going in, and I think um, doing full remote can certainly sometimes be challenging. You have to have an understanding of the team and the people around you. It's one of those classic things. After you've met a person, you can immediately put a voice to their emails, that kind of thing. But this was very much a company that you were typically, everybody who was technical was at a senior level or above, and so there was a certain degree of trust there. But I think as well for companies, there is a difficulty with traditional management structures. The idea of I can't see you, working. And
Mm,
in the world of technology, in the world of software, a lot of this traditional um, typing kind of pool mentality doesn't seem to work anymore. And we we do see that with a lot of companies that they've kind of restructured their offices and started saying, well, what is the purpose of the office? They're thinking that again. They're not saying everybody should work from home, and particularly if you're in your early 20s, the chances are you don't have a great home setup and necessarily. And so for some people, they just like going into the office. For some people, it's a better setup, but the ability to be able to opt out on certain days is, I think, what people like having the option of. But I think where it makes a difference is to get certain things done, you do want to get everybody together. To onboard people, if you are joining a company, you don't really want to be remote to begin with if you have the option. But as time goes by, then that's going to be a better option for the work that you understand you need to do. And so, I think that there is. I think we're all still. I'd like to say we're still adjusting, but I don't think that that's quite right. I think we have adjusted, and what we recognise is that different people want different things, and that's both from people actually doing what might be the work that is managed and managing. And I think some people in management positions have struggled to identify what it is that how they do management in that kind of position. So I think that that's going to be an ongoing thing. I don't think it's done. I don't think it's settled. I don't think there is a single answer. And I think companies are going to be oscillating over this one over the next few years, if not
yeah,
longer.
yeah. I think you're right. I mean, from my perspective, I think there is something we have lost. I think, I think you're very, very correct in pointing out that when somebody joins a new company, that sort of personal interaction, not just through a screen, actually meeting somebody in person is very important because
Mm.
it builds that relationship, doesn't it, very early on?
Yeah, it's where you learn this. It's where you learn other people's signals. It helps you create an identity. But there is that notion that once you've established that identity, and I've had this with dealing with people years after I've actually worked with them. it's getting, it's like getting back on a bicycle. So it's clearly there is a something about relationships, once they've been formed, that you can do different things with them. In other words, not all kinds of work or all stages of your work, your employment, with a particular employer, are going to be the same, and it's going to vary from job to job and the nature of your work. But I think that variability is also confounding, because sometimes people are trying to say it's all remote, or it's hybrid, or it's all in the office. And the point is that the answer is possibly it depends and it changes, which is a far more complex answer. But I think that if people recognize that's something they want to look at and go, yeah, actually, this is going to be a bit better. And I, what is the thing that's going to help them at this stage? What the answer for the second 6 months of a job may be very, very different to the answer to your first 6 months. Um,
Yes. Yeah.
and I think that makes a difference. And I think we also have to remember that geographically, it's how long does it take people to get to work? There's always that. I know that I've felt sometimes I've worked things out. I've sorted out ideas as I've been going into work. But at other times, I felt utterly frustrated because it was like an hour to get from one place to another, and it's just like, well, actually, that's 2 hours of my day, and that's effectively dead time. Whereas at other times, I'm thinking, oh, it's 20 minutes. Different roles, different and different locations. Oh, it's 20 minutes either way. That's not a big deal. But for a lot of people, and with a lot of desirable companies, you may find that you have a very long commute, and that commute is not productive. A lot of the time, you almost want to kind of go into the office, focus on people, have a lot of discussions, and then in another part of the week, you're focusing on that. If you're writing code, then that may be helped by a little bit of isolation, but you may also want to have the ability to work with somebody and just say, "Hey, could you look at this code? I'm struggling with this. I could do with a hand." So, I was encouraging people to reach out for help. So it's very much. I think it's a far more complex equation than people assumed, because I think it comes down a lot to personality. It comes out to the stage in your work, and whatever projects you're on. And very much also the company that you're in. So I think that is definitely, if when people are looking for things, I think they need to keep in mind that they may not know the answers, but they may also want to ask some far more complex questions than I think people are used to asking.
Yeah. Good. Okay. I'm sure that conversation could go on, but let's maybe
Yeah.
change tack slightly. So it'd be very interesting to know what sort of you're focusing on at the moment. So do you have any sort of specialist areas that you focus your workshop or your consulting
Well,
around?
it's kind of interesting because I've a lot of the stuff that I've ended up. So there's some things that kind of go around, as it were. They've kind of gone in a circle, and there's other things that have kind of more consolidated. So something that I started doing, probably about 2017, 2018, is started doing more software architecture workshops. In fact, I was doing that a few years before, but software architecture has become very much a topic that people want to talk about. But one of the things that, or rather, not so much talk about, but learn things about, realize that it's probably more than a couple of diagrams on a whiteboard, and it's not just whatever it is that a person called an architect does. It's more complex than that. And perhaps when dealing with large software systems, there is this idea that the architecture kind of defines the costing in the long term. It's a shift in philosophy from looking at things as being project based, and therefore I deliver this and that's done, to something that this is a product that's going to last for years. It may define the company. Maybe that requires a different perspective than project based thinking, which is actually I'm going to say mildly toxic for software. It doesn't necessarily produce good software, because your goal is to deliver at the end of a deadline. Whereas architecture tells you, yeah, you know what, this is here for a while, and we're going to experience change that we don't anticipate. So architecture has been a growing theme, and importantly, architecture with agility is one of the things that I talk about a lot. It's just like, well, hang on, how do we integrate architecture, which sometimes people think of in a very I don't know, a very staid fashion, a very upfront design kind of approach, and a very plan-driven approach. And sometimes the people have that experience of and that colours what they think about it. Um, Whereas I guess my view has never been that. So I've found that the idea is like, well, yeah, it's always something that's evolving, and it needs to be responsive and based on feedback. And I'm not peddling any particular agile approach. I think that there are enough people doing that. We don't need to add me to the noise. Um, and I've ended up, this has been an area that people found really quite interesting. Is like, how do we concentrate on this kind of like getting a good feedback based flow, but also building an architecture that, is sustainable from an economic perspective, and is actually an asset to a company. So seems to be where I get a lot of demand for that. I've moved away, or the market's moved away from asking me questions about agile adoption and stuff like that. Probably because I probably because I tend to always position myself as an independent, which means I don't do certification. I'm not backing anybody's brand. And in one sense, I have a very old school view of what would be considered to be agile development, in the sense of, it's kind of based on a set of values rather than a set of practices. It's based on trying to look for flow. It's based on adapting your workflow to your own situation, which means that you can have two different teams in the same company, both actually being agile and yet doing completely different things, because it works in each of their contexts, because they've adapted into that. And that's not the answer that people want from training in process and certification. So around the time 2015, 2016, 2017, I found myself personally moving away from that, but I think it's also moved away from me. So I found it very much, where my agile message gets through is very much in talks, but in context mostly. Very much it's about the architecture. But the other thing that seems to be ongoing is increasing demand for unit testing skills, and I still teach a lot of test-driven development practices. And I always tell people, it's like, I don't intend that you necessarily come out of this training course with the deep desire to do TDD, but I do want you to understand the nature of the tests that you write, to think about it. And it actually fits in with the architectural perspective, and that perspective of, it's a product. We're going to have to come back to it next year and the year after and the year after. So whatever I deliver next week, honestly, you don't want to tell somebody this to their face, but with hindsight, it's always obvious. All that work you did for that deadline, not really worth it. Because guess what? That deadline was followed by another deadline, which is followed by another deadline. So the game that you're playing is not about delivering according to the deadline. It's delivering so that you can deliver the deadline following, and the one after that, and the one after that. You're playing a fundamentally different game. It's not a sprint. You are doing long distance running, and you need a very different pacing. And so when I talk about TDD, I integrate it in terms of what kind of tests would you like to read as a developer. So that, I think, is that one is very much a big deal. And what is interesting for me is that there's actually a recording of me at a conference in 2016, and it was during the Q&A, and I was asked about AI. Now, you've got to remember, 2016, people had no idea about what was coming down the line in the next 8 years. But in a moment of accidental prescience, I said one of the things we're going to have to actually be really good at is knowing what it is that we want, and therefore knowing how to test. And I find that at the moment, a lot of people are committing code that they've not tested because they trust the LLM. That's not LLMs. When you understand the architecture of LLMs, it's astonishing they produce anything that compiles at all.
Yes.
I think that is a great achievement. They are impressive technically, but the thing is, you are still in charge, and it requires the kind of set of skills I found that, and I think this one started being a thing during the pandemic as well. Some of the sessions and seminars that I was running for companies, who are also taking advantage of the fact that if I'm running something, we can adapt, or we can do it on a week by week basis and just do a couple of hours. We don't have to be in person and do it all in a number of days. And so we'd adapt the flow. But one of the areas that seem to be increasingly popular is the quality of your development practices. How do you know if you're writing good code? How do you get better at this stuff? And that's not a fixed set of things. It's, if you like, it's a process of inquiry and that critical thinking. And that's what I guess I've always been quite interested in. That seems to be still, I'd say that's in demand at the moment. The idea that you've got to know what it is that you want and how do you articulate that. And so that I've seen as a trend. So kind of continuing on the lines of what I was doing, I think the other thing that surprised me a little bit is I've gone back to one of the things I did first, which is teaching programming languages, teaching people how to program, which I didn't expect. That was kind of the beginning of my career. Because we have got so many more, as it were, citizen programmers, data scientists, scientists who do not consider their primary role as being programmers. And yet there is no way you can do many of these jobs without touching code. So we have a very new class of people coming into the software space who want more than Excel, but would not consider themselves software engineers. And so I found that I've been doing a little bit in that space, and that's been kind of interesting. You get different stories, people have different perceptions, and certainly the way they pick ideas up is very different. Each person's experience is very different. It's like they pick up, tips and tricks, but nobody has the whole picture, and so there's a very different need there, but also very application oriented because they're only doing it because they want to build something.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear. I mean, in terms of people coming from that sort of directional perspective, do you focus on the principles of programming, or do you sort of dive straight into a particular language?
I normally normally there's a context. They say we're doing this, so people normally come in with a bit of expectation, a bit of knowledge already. The chances are in these contexts we are going to be talking Python. That is kind of very much the lingua franca in this space. So people have already dabbled. I mean, that's the point, is that you can dabble in Python the minute you just open. You just fire it up on the command line, and you can just add two numbers, and you're already programming Python effectively. I remember showing it to my kids when they were younger, saying you can use it as a calculator. It just happens to be a calculator that you can type things out and you get really big answers out if you want. So normally people are coming to. So what I'm doing is I am using the medium of a given language with a goal of teaching that, but I am also trying to instill principles, because normally people have, thrown it together with probably the way that I do woodwork. In a fairly unprincipled ad hoc fashion based on a few tools, without knowing really the bigger picture. And nobody would ever mistake me for a carpenter or somebody who can actually do anything useful in the house beyond a few basic things. And so therefore what I'm trying to do is, here's a bigger picture. And so I'm very much driven by the questions in those cases, because that's going to tell you where people are at, but it's also going to be telling you perhaps the things they were not sure of that they, as non-programmers, would not have thought about. If I spoke to a programmer, somebody who had that as their background, and had whether they'd come through a computer science, software engineering training, or just been a developer for a number of years, so they already had a kind of body of knowledge that they'd accumulated one way or another. And you're just saying, oh, it's another language. I need to learn how to be at home in that. How do I do this? Whereas other people have a very different set of preconceptions and very different mental models, which I find fascinating. But it is also that makes you kind of, as somebody who I like teaching because I learn. Whenever I do that, other people's questions normally encourage me to find a different way of explaining things, and often that improves it for me as well. But yeah, we're getting a lot of people in that space, and I think that is defining a very different kind of class of developer. And I think the thing we're going to see coming down the line with that one is a lot more are going to be using LLMs to assist them in their work. And then they're going to discover it's not working out the way they hoped. When it works, it's absolutely wonderful. When it doesn't, then they're going to say, well, actually, what I'm dealing with is legacy code. because it was not written by me. It was written by, that's the whole thing about an LLM. The moment you use an LLM, you are creating legacy code because it wasn't written by you. You've got the problem of debugging somebody else's code, or if not debugging it, understanding how to change it. And so it's a different set of skills. It's a more critical reading kind of approach, and a set of principles to kind of sort of put it in is quite helpful. Where that I think it's not just syntax. There are a set of principles here, and introducing people to those gently, one way or another, I think is very helpful.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, that was a really good explanation. Thank you. Just a quick interruption to remind you to follow or subscribe to the show in your podcast app. Every download and listen improves the show's discoverability. By subscribing and downloading, you'll be helping more people to develop successful careers in tech. And my thanks to you for being a listener. If you have any suggestions about things you'd like covered in the show, or potential guests, why not leave a comment or review? You may even get a shout out in a subsequent episode. So one of the questions I probably would have asked you when we first spoke was around, what if you started your career again in today's world, what would you do? What I'm really interested in now is knowing what is it that you wish you'd known at the start of your career that you know now?
Oh yeah, that's a good question, and I think that one for me is, some of it is going to be, it's an interesting mix. Is that there's the part that you normally get from people who've been around a while, which is it's not all about the technology. It's not all about the code. That actually a lot of the stuff that we have, a lot of the joy and the challenges are the people things. Okay, so that one is a given, but at the same time, I want to acknowledge the younger person that I was, and also some of the stuff I've been doing recently, just getting back into a couple of things. It's just like, actually, but don't deny yourself the technical thing. It's fun, it's enjoyable. Having that appreciation for detail is its own, at one level, is its own reward. So don't miss out on that. When you are enjoying something, do look for the things that excite you from a technical point of view, because it allows you to know, because that's normally drives you into an area in depth, and it allows you to understand what that feels like. So you can, and I think that's quite an important one. I was talking about architects earlier on, and somebody asked me about skills for architects a few years ago. I said, well, I think it's very difficult because different organizations define it in different ways, and in some organizations it's a more general leadership responsibility. It can be a position of a hierarchy within the organization, not necessarily technical. In other cases, it's very, very code centered and very developer oriented. So the answer is very much and it depends. But one of the things that I said is what makes a good architect is that they have come to know at least one domain and one technical space in depth. So they know what that feels like. And when they find themselves working outside that space or adjacent to it, they can also go, oh, I know I don't know enough here, because I know what it feels like to know that level of detail. And that's what becomes that's good technical leadership. You go, right, okay, who here in this team does have that? So in other words, you don't have to know everything. You can rely on other people, and spot the people who are good at this. They will, you're going to build something together. Software development is a social activity in this sense. So it's kind of both of those things. If I've been told that this is way more complex than you're anticipating, it's not just about the code, but also the other message. It's not just about the people aspect. It is, when we use the term these days, socio-technical. It is a socio-technical thing. Appreciate both sides of that and enjoy both and get into both. I think that would have helped me. It would have also led, I'd probably, if I had the ability to speak to myself then, I think it would also puzzled me, and I don't know, I quite like puzzles, so that would have made me inquisitive. and I would have been interested to find out more at that point. But at the very least, I think that's what I think at this. Asking me today, that's the answer I would give you.
Brilliant. Now, there's one question I've been asking more recent guests, which I probably wouldn't have asked you at the time. So, and I think this is quite important, but what do you do outside of technology in your spare time?
Right. In my spare time, it's a mix of things. Let me think. Let's. Right. Well, I read. I've got back in. I've been reading a lot more. I think the pandemic helped me get back into that. So when I do travel, I normally travel with a book that's not a technical book. I got out of the habit of reading as much fiction as I used to many years ago. Probably in the 2010s, I was not doing that. But really, the last few years, I've got back into reading. Very much. I also write. I write short fiction occasionally. And I'm involved in various events around that. Sometimes spoken word events. Go somewhere and actually read out a story. So that I play guitar, not necessarily brilliantly, but it turns out that it's a good area to geek out in. And there's a group of people I normally jam with. And it's kind of interesting. We kind of learned gradually over successive sessions that actually over half of us are software people. It's,
Right.
it's just one of those things that comes out because you don't go in there going like, okay, what is everybody actually doing? You kind of go in there and you're looking at people, looking at people's gear, or it's just like, okay, what songs are we going to play? And you're focusing on, your own preferences and interest in rock music and stuff like that, and and kind of people's own musical language. People have very different backgrounds, particularly in rock music. You get very few people who are formally trained. I am definitely not formally trained, so my knowledge of music theory is very different to somebody who's gone through classical piano training. But then a lot of guitarists don't have any music theory, so you've got this kind of really interesting communications, and you're not sitting there going like, what else do you do? Oh, you're in software as well. It normally comes out by accident, and then it kind of goes, went around the room, and it was a case of like, on a couple of occasions, it's like, yeah, we're all, most of us are either in software or software adjacent. That was kind of, it's when you end up talking programming languages with the people that you also talk guitar gear over. That's quite funny. That's stuff, and I do a bit of photography. In fact, actually, I'm just trying to think. I think in the last since I spoke to you, I'm now a professional photographer because somebody actually bought a framed photograph of mine. So, but that's only one. I don't think I can claim to be running a business on that. So I do a number of different things that don't look like computing.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear. And it does sound like your time is very full then.
Yes, very much so. And I've basically got kind of grown kids seeing them out the door, and it's like, oh, I've got a little bit more time here. So yeah, definitely kind of looking to these things. I find that they normally help me come back into software with a clearer mind, or it allows me to just freely associate and come up with new ideas or ways of solving problems. So I find it deeply refreshing.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And talking of time has really flown by. So,
Indeed.
yeah, what I'd like to know actually is, Kevin, if anybody wants to get in contact with you or learn a bit more about you, what's the best thing to do? Where can they find out more about you?
Well, okay. So this answer will definitely change since 2017. Ever since the kind of, I don't know, the deconstruction, reconstruction of social media. I am on most platforms. I'm on Twitter X still as Kevlin Henney. You can find me on Mastodon, Kevlin at mastodon.social. You can find me on Blue Sky. I think I'm just Kevlin there. And you can find me on Threads. I think I'm Kevlin.Henney because that's my Instagram handle. You can find me on Instagram, of course, but I don't. I'm only occasionally do people try and message me on Instagram about technical stuff, which does feel a bit weird because it's very much not that. And LinkedIn is one of the most reliable ways. Yes. if you look for Kevlin Henney, and I pay a lot more attention to LinkedIn these days than I did say in 2017. So Kevlin Henney, I'm fair. Yeah, it's still a fairly somewhat internet unique name. So if you Google that, you will typically find me, and I'm more than happy to connect with people and communicate through any of these media.
Perfect. And once again, Kevlin, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It's been great chatting with you.
Thank you very much, Phil.
Thank you once again for listening to the IT Career and Adjuster podcast. I'd also like to thank Kevlin for his return to the podcast after such a long gap. Please remember to subscribe to the podcast and tune in again tomorrow for another new episode.